In 1882, a modest foundation stone was laid in a Barcelona field, but the man who turned it into a stone forest died with only a fraction of his vision standing. Antoni Gaudí spent 43 years obsessing over this structure before a tram crushed him in 1926. Today, it remains the world's largest unfinished puzzle, a 560-foot defiance of gravity that shouldn't exist. When anarchist groups torched Gaudí's workshop in 1936, they burned the only blueprints to his complex geometry. Architects were left staring at 18 massive towers and shattered plaster models, forced to reverse engineer a genius's mind. For nearly a century, 9 generations of stonemasons have carved 13,500 tons of stone without a single original drawing to guide them. How did they continue a project that technically lost its way 88 years ago? The scale of this ambition forced engineers to invent entirely new mathematical languages just to keep the central spire from collapsing under its own weight. We are using AI today to see what Gaudí saw in his dreams, revealing 3 structural decisions that should have made this cathedral impossible to finish. From the hidden geometry of the forest-like columns to the secret of the 172-meter peak, this is the moment the structure finally reveals its true face. Discover the structural secret buried inside these walls for 140 years, the one Gaudí took to his grave, and we finally unearthed. To understand why this building defies every law of traditional architecture, we have to look at the dirt and smoke of Barcelona in the late 19th century. The city was bursting at its seams, tearing down its medieval walls to breathe. In a desolate patch of land known as the Eixample, a simple bookstore owner named Josep Maria Bocabella envisioned a temple dedicated to the Holy Family. He wanted a place of atonement, a sanctuary for the poor in a city increasingly defined by industrial grit and social unrest. He didn't hire a revolutionary. He hired Francisco de Paula del Villar, an architect who played by the rules. Villar's plan was safe, predictable, and strictly neo-Gothic. He envisioned pointed arches, flying buttresses, and the familiar silhouettes of the great European cathedrals. Construction began on St. Joseph's Day in 1882, starting with the crypt. But the stones themselves seemed to resist the mediocrity of the design. Villar quarreled with the building committee over the cost of materials and the technical direction of the masonry. By 1883, he walked away from the half-finished crypt, leaving a hole in the ground and a project without a leader. That was the moment the trajectory of architectural history shifted. The committee turned to a 31-year-old man with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for being difficult. Antoni Gaudí didn't just want to finish the crypt. He wanted to reinvent the very concept of a building. He inherited a traditional foundation, but possessed a mind that saw the world in curves, bones, and branches. For the first few years, he worked within the constraints of Villar's initial footprint, but his thoughts were already escaping into the sky. He began to transform the neo-Gothic columns into something organic, something that breathed. Gaudí spent his days walking through the woods, observing how trees managed to hold massive canopies of leaves without the help of external supports. He realized that nature never used flying buttresses. A tree stands because its weight is distributed through its trunk and into the earth, through a complex network of roots. He decided that his cathedral would not be held up by the crutches of traditional Gothic architecture. He would build a stone forest, but to do this he had to solve a mathematical problem that had baffled architects for centuries: how to support a massive vertical load using tilted columns that didn't look like they could hold a roof. He turned his workshop into a laboratory of structural physics. Because he lacked the computer modeling tools we have today, he built his designs using gravity itself. He created a system of hanging strings and small bags of lead shot. Each string represented a column or an arch, and the weight of the lead shot represented the weight of the stone. As the strings hung from the ceiling, gravity pulled them into perfect catenary curves, the strongest natural shape for an arch. He then placed a mirror on the floor and looked at the reflection. In that mirror, the hanging strings became towers reaching for the heavens. He was seeing the future in reverse. This wasn't just art. It was a radical calculation of tension and compression that pushed the limits of sandstone and granite. By the turn of the century, the Sagrada Familia had become Gaudí's entire world. He moved his bed into the workshop, living among the plaster dust and the skeletal models. He stopped taking on other commissions. He became a hermit of the construction site, his clothes becoming tattered and his focus narrowing until only the stones remained. He knew he would never see the end of the project. He famously said that his client, God, was in no hurry. He began to build the Nativity facade, a riot of stone that looked as if the mountain itself was melting into the shapes of saints and animals. He focused on completing this one section to its full height, serving as a beacon for future generations, a physical manifest of the scale he intended for the rest of the structure. But as the towers rose, the man behind them began to fade. By 1926, Gaudí was 73 years old. He was a ghost in his own city, a figure so consumed by the geometry of the spires that he neglected the world around him. On the evening of June 7th, he left the construction site for his daily walk to the Church of St. Philip Neri for confession. He was deep in thought, perhaps calculating the load-bearing capacity of the central towers or the way the Mediterranean light would hit the stained glass. He stepped onto the tracks of the Gran Via de les Corts Catalanes, unaware of the number 30 tram bearing down on him. The impact was brutal. Because he carried no identity papers and his clothes were fastened with safety pins, the passers-by and the tram driver assumed he was a nameless beggar. He lay in the street, ignored by taxis, until a group of people finally took him to the Santa Cruz Hospital, a facility for the indigent. It wasn't until the chaplain of the Sagrada Familia recognized him the next day that the city realized its greatest genius was dying in a common ward. When doctors offered to move him to a private clinic, he refused, saying his place was among the poor. 3 days later, on June 10th, Antoni Gaudí breathed his last. The city of Barcelona ground to a halt. Thousands lined the streets for a funeral procession that stretched for miles. He was buried in the heart of his unfinished masterpiece, in the crypt he had inherited and transformed. But the tragedy wasn't just the death of a man. It was the sudden silence of the project. Gaudí had never written a book on his methods. He had no definitive set of blueprints. He left behind a labyrinth of plaster models, a few sketches, and a team of craftsmen who understood his spirit, but struggled to grasp his complex mathematics. The towers stood as jagged, broken fingers reaching into the sky, surrounded by a city that didn't know if the dream could survive without its dreamer. The original plan died with him. Everything changed. The silence that followed Gaudí's funeral was not just a mark of respect. It was the sound of a massive, gears-grinding halt. Domènec Sugranyes, Gaudí's most devoted assistant, stood in the dust-choked workshop and realized the terrifying reality of his new position. He wasn't just an architect anymore. He was a medium trying to channel a ghost. The master had left the stage, and the script he left behind was written in a language of plaster, wire, and gravity that only he fully understood. For 10 years, Sugranyes and a small team of disciples struggled to keep the momentum alive, finishing the Tower of San Bernabé. They worked with a haunting sense of urgency, as if they knew the piece of the city was a fragile glass about to shatter. They were carving stone by stone, deciphering the warped surfaces and ruled geometry that Gaudí had whispered about in his final years. But the technical challenge was only the beginning. The world outside the construction site was darkening. Barcelona was becoming a pressure cooker of political tension, and the Sagrada Familia, the Cathedral of the Poor, was about to become a target for those who saw it not as a miracle, but as a monument to a past they wanted to burn. Think about the sheer audacity of continuing a project of this scale during a national collapse. By the mid-1930s, the Spanish Civil War was no longer a threat. It was a reality bleeding into the streets. The construction site, once a place of prayer and precision, became a skeletal fortress in a city divided by ideology. In July 1936, the thin veil of order tore apart completely. Anarchist groups fueled by a visceral hatred for the institutional church saw the rising spires of the Sagrada Familia as a symbol of the old world they intended to dismantle. They didn't just want to stop the construction, they wanted to erase the memory of the man who designed it. They stormed the workshop, the very sanctuary where Gaudí had lived and breathed for decades. Here is the thing that history often glosses over. They didn't just break windows. They targeted the intelligence of the building. They smashed the large-scale plaster models into thousands of jagged white fragments. They threw the original sketches and blueprints into a bonfire that scorched the walls of the studio. When the smoke cleared, the project was functionally lobotomized. The models were the only three-dimensional database of Gaudí's structural logic. Without them, the slanted columns and hyperbolic vaults were just strange shapes with no mathematical anchor. The world believed the dream was dead. The architects were left standing over a graveyard of plaster dust, trying to salvage enough pieces to understand how the central nave was supposed to connect to the towers. This was the moment of the Great Gap. For decades, the site was a quiet ruin. Critics and rival architects began to circle the skeletal remains, arguing that the building should be left exactly as it was, a scorched monument to a failed ambition. They claimed that any attempt to finish it would be a fake Gaudí, a betrayal of the original spirit. But they didn't account for the persistence of the stonemasons, who had Gaudí's geometry etched into their muscle memory. Look closely at the stone, and you will see the transition from the handcrafted grit of the 19th century to the desperate improvisations of the post-war era. For nearly 20 years, progress was measured in inches, not feet. The team had to become forensic architects. They gathered the shattered fragments of the models, some no larger than a coin, and began the agonizing process of gluing them back together. It was the world's most complex jigsaw puzzle, where the pieces didn't just form a picture, but a structural calculation. They were reverse engineering a genius's mind while the city around them was being rebuilt from the scars of war. They lacked the funds, the materials, and the political will. But they had the stone, and they had a secret code that Gaudí had buried within the design itself, a mathematical consistency that suggested the building wasn't just a church, but a self-correcting organism. While the public saw a slow-moving construction site, the engineers were discovering that Gaudí's geometry was far more advanced than the technology of the time could handle. They realized that he wasn't using traditional architectural shapes. He was using ruled surfaces, shapes like hyperboloids and parabolas that are found in nature, in the curve of a leaf or the cooling of a star. These shapes weren't just for aesthetics. They were functional. They allowed the stone to distribute weight in ways that defied traditional Gothic limitations. This meant that the building had a hidden mathematical language, a code that could, in theory, be deciphered even without the original drawings. If they could crack the DNA of the columns, they could grow the rest of the building. But to do that, they needed something that wouldn't exist for another half-century. They were waiting for a technology that could see what the human eye couldn't. The project became a ghost of itself, a skeletal presence in the Barcelona skyline that seemed destined to remain unfinished forever. By the 1950s and 60s, the Passion facade began to rise, but it was met with fierce controversy. The new sculptures were angular, bone-like, and harsh, a stark contrast to the organic, melting forms of the Nativity facade. The public was outraged. They felt the soul of the building was being replaced by cold, modern interpretation. The workers felt the weight of a city's judgment. Every stone laid was a gamble. Every decision was a guess. The architects lived in a constant state of fear that they were building a lie. They were working in the shadow of a man who had become a saint in the eyes of the people, and any mistake would be seen as a desecration. The tension between the past and the future was tearing the project apart from the inside. Then came the turning point that would fundamentally shift the destiny of the stone forest. It happened in the late 1970s and early 80s, as the first primitive computers began to hum in university laboratories. A new generation of architects realized that the manual calculations they had been performing for 50 years were reaching a dead end. They couldn't calculate the stress loads for the central towers, the ones that would eventually reach 172 meters, using only slide rules and paper. The building had become too tall, too heavy, and too complex for the human mind to grasp in its entirety. They needed a way to simulate gravity. They needed to find the structural secret that Gaudí had taken to his grave. This wasn't just about finishing a roof. It was about preventing a catastrophic collapse that would level the entire neighborhood. The moment of no return occurred when the team decided to embrace the very thing Gaudí never had: digital logic. They began to use aeronautical software, the kind used to design fighter jets, to model the wind resistance of the spires. For the first time, they could see the invisible forces of the Mediterranean wind pushing against the stone. They discovered that the warped geometry Gaudí chose wasn't just a stylistic whim, it was the most aerodynamic shape possible for a structure of that height. The computer was proving that the madman of 1926 was actually a structural prophet. But as they began to plug the data into these new machines, the software started to reveal something unsettling. The central towers, the pride of the entire vision, were mathematically impossible to build using the materials and methods currently on site. The weight was too great. The stone forest was crushing itself. The foundations laid in 1882 weren't designed for the 21st century reality of the spire. Irreversible. After this, nothing would be the same. The realization that the central towers were mathematically impossible to build using the methods of the past didn't stop the project. It forced a revolution. By the late 1980s, the architects were facing a crisis of mass. If they continued to pile stone upon stone in the traditional way, the weight of the Tower of Jesus Christ, the central spire destined to reach 172 meters, would exert a pressure so immense that it would literally crush the foundations laid a century earlier. The stone forest was becoming too heavy for its own roots. This was the moment the team had to step away from the chisel and toward the screen. They began a process of forensic architecture that sounds more like a crime scene investigation than a construction project. They took the thousands of charred, broken plaster fragments salvaged from the 1936 fire and subjected them to high-resolution laser scanning. This wasn't just about recording shapes, it was about feeding a digital brain the shattered remnants of a genius's logic. The AI reconstruction revealed something the human eye had missed for generations. As the algorithms analyzed the curves of the fragments, they found a recurring mathematical constant. Gaudí hadn't just been making pretty shapes, he had been using a system of ruled geometry, where every point on a curved surface could be defined by a straight line. This was the Rosetta Stone of the Sagrada Familia. It meant that even without the original blueprints, the architects could use AI to predict exactly where a column should lean or how a vault should twist. They were no longer guessing. They were finally speaking Gaudí's language. But knowing the shape was one thing, making it stand was another. The weight problem remained. To solve it, the engineers had to look away from the world of cathedrals and toward the world of modern bridge building and aerospace engineering. They discovered the structural secret that would allow the spire to defy gravity. They moved away from solid stone blocks and moved toward a revolutionary technique called post-tension stone. Think of it like a spine. Instead of just stacking vertebrae, they ran high-strength steel cables through the center of the stones. Once the stones were in place, they pulled those cables with incredible force, clamping the stones together into a single, rigid, and incredibly strong vertical beam. This allowed them to build towers that were hollow, light, and virtually indestructible. It was a technique Gaudí couldn't have imagined in 1882, but it was the only way to fulfill his 19th century vision using 21st century physics. The stone was no longer just sitting there, it was being forged into a weapon against the wind. But as the towers began to climb at a pace never seen before, a new mystery emerged from the walls of the Passion facade. Visitors and scholars began to notice a strange grid carved into the stone, a magic square. It's a 4x4 grid of numbers where every row, column, and diagonal adds up to 33. For years, people argued about its meaning. Was it a Masonic code, a secret mathematical key to the building's dimensions? The truth was more grounded, but no less profound. 33 was the age of Christ at the time of the crucifixion. This wasn't just a building, it was a physical manifestation of a narrative, a puzzle where every number and every angle was a syllable in a larger story. The architects realized that Gaudí's forest wasn't just for shade. It was a cathedral that functioned like a giant, stone-carved book, meant to be read by anyone who looked up. The final challenge was the peak. At 172 meters, the Tower of Jesus Christ would make the Sagrada Familia the tallest church in the world. But why that specific height? The answer lies in the geography of Barcelona itself. To the south of the city lies the hill of Montjuïc, which stands at 173 meters. Gaudí, in his final years, was adamant that his work should not exceed the work of God. He designed the spire to be exactly 1 meter shorter than the mountain. It was a final act of humility from a man who had spent his life building a structure that seemed to challenge the heavens. This was the secret of the peak that had been buried in the proportions of the site since the first stone was laid. It was a boundary, a line in the sand between human ambition and the natural world. The construction site today is a hive of 3D printers and massive CNC machines carving granite with the precision of a surgeon. The gap between the manual stonemasonry of the 1880s and the robotic carving of the 2020s is a chasm of technology, yet they are working on the same blocks of stone. The project is now entering its final phase. The spires are being assembled off-site in large modules and lowered into place by cranes that seem to touch the clouds. For the first time in 140 years, the end is in sight. The target for completion is 2026, the centenary of Gaudí's death. It is a moment 9 generations in the making. The children who watched the first stones rise are long gone, and the grandchildren of the men who salvaged the models from the fire are now the ones overseeing the digital simulations. As the final stones of the central spire are anchored into place, the loop that began in 1882 finally closes. We have unearthed the secrets Gaudí took to his grave, not through a hidden map, but through a relentless pursuit of the mathematics he left behind. The Sagrada Familia is no longer an unfinished puzzle. It is a testament to the fact that a vision, if powerful enough, can survive war, fire, and the death of its creator. It proves that a building is not just stone and mortar. It is a conversation between the past and the future. Every generation added a stone, every architect added a calculation, and every worker added a year of their life to a dream they knew they would never see completed. The structure that stands today shouldn't exist. It was designed by a man who used hanging strings to calculate gravity. It was nearly erased by flames, and it was finished by machines that think in ways its architect could never have dreamed. But as the sun sets over Barcelona, hitting the stained glass and turning the stone forest into a cathedral of light, the distinction between the centuries vanishes. The 13,500 tons of stone don't care about the technology used to carve them. They only care about the weight they carry. This monument proved that human ambition, when anchored in a profound understanding of nature, is stronger than the forces that try to tear it down. Centuries of impossibility, still standing. The Sagrada Familia is the ultimate proof that the most durable things we build are not made of stone, but of the persistence required to keep placing one stone on top of another, even when the blueprints are gone. Every monument you've ever visited has a hidden history, a struggle buried inside its walls that no tour guide will ever tell you. At Monument Reborn, we bring those struggles back to life, peeling back the layers of time to show you the human cost of greatness. What monument do you want to see rebuilt next? Have you ever stood beneath these spires and felt the weight of those 140 years? Tell us your story in the comments. Subscribe to join us as we unearth the next secret of history. There are more towers to climb and more dreams to reconstruct.